This move opens lines for the queen and a bishop while contesting the center, preparing to develop pieces and control key squares. This move, knight to f6, is a very common and solid response to 1d4, immediately challenging the center and preparing to develop a piece towards the kingside, often leading to systems like the Indian defenses. This move establishes central pawn control and prepares to challenge black's knight, often leading to systems like the Queen's Indian defense or Nimzo Indian defense, aiming for a solid pawn structure and harmonious piece development. This move transitions into the Queen's Indian defense, a solid choice that prepares to develop the bishop to b7, putting pressure on white's center and controlling the long diagonal. This move develops the knight to a natural central square, preparing for further pawn breaks and controlling key squares while maintaining flexibility in black's defensive setup. This move initiates the Nimzo Indian defense, a solid and strategically rich opening where black immediately challenges white's central pawn structure and prevents white from establishing a comfortable queenside pawn majority. This move, e3, reinforces the d4 pawn and prepares to develop the f1 bishop, calmly developing white's position after black's active b-flat 4. Castling is a fundamental development move, safeguarding the king and bringing a rook towards the center for active play. This move develops the bishop to an active square, eyeing the f5 square and supporting a potential kingside pawn advance later in the game. This move initiates a central pawn break, aiming to challenge white's control of the d4 square and open lines for black's pieces in a typical Catalan or Queen's Indian setup. This move aims to challenge black's bishop for control of the c5 square and potentially gain space by forcing a decision on the bishop's placement. This move concludes the early development of the queen's gambit declined orthodox variation, by exchanging the bishop for the knight, leading to a potentially unbalanced pawn structure for white. This move creates doubled c-pawns, which can be a strategic weakness, but also opens the b-file for potential future piece activity and grants white a central pawn majority. Developing the knight to c6 challenges white's central pawn majority and prepares to contest the d4 square, aiming for a more active piece placement. This move prepares to develop the kingside knight to a more active square, potentially to g3 or f4, while also supporting a central pawn advance and reinforcing the kingside defense. This move prepares to fianchetto the queenside bishop, creating a strong diagonal pressure against white's central pawn structure and potentially opening the b-file for queenside play. This move initiates a central pawn struggle, aiming to control key squares and open lines for piece activity, a common theme in many queen's pawn openings. This retreat of the knight to e8 is a strategic repositioning to support the d6 pawn and prepare for a potential queenside expansion with cxd4 followed by b5. Castling kingside consolidates the king's safety and prepares for potential central pawn advances, while connecting the rooks. This move develops the bishop to a more active square, aiming to exchange it for white's strong knight on c3, which controls key central squares and supports white's potential kingside attack. This move initiates a central pawn advance, aiming to create space and potentially challenge black's queenside influence, but it also weakens the kingside pawn structure. This move aggressively challenges white's central pawn on e4, aiming to create dynamic imbalances and potentially open lines for black's pieces. This move prepares to challenge black's control of the central light squares and potentially redeploy the knight to a more active square like f5 or h5. This move initiates a fianchetto of the kingside bishop, aiming to reinforce the kingside and create a powerful long-term diagonal after potentially pushing the g-pawn further. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, supporting the central pawn push and preparing to contest the long diagonal. This knight maneuver prepares to contest the important e4-c5 diagonal and supports the pawn break, with f5, aiming to challenge white's central control. This move, exf5, challenges black's central pawn majority and aims to open lines for white's pieces, potentially creating attacking chances on the kingside while seeking to exploit the weakened pawn structure that may arise for black after gxf5. This captures the pawn, sacrificing the knight for the moment to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines for your pieces. This recapture opens the b-file for white's rook and removes black's active bishop, aiming to exploit the potential weaknesses in black's pawn structure and gain space. This move aims to recapture the pawn and activate the bishop, but it weakens white's pawn structure by creating doubled pawns on the c-file, which can be a target later in the game. This move aims to open the f-file for attacking possibilities against black's kingside and potentially gain space in the center by removing the advanced black pawn. Black recaptures the piece, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines for active piece play. This move is a powerful attempt to exploit white's temporarily weakened king's defenses and create attacking chances on the kingside, leveraging the open h-file and the queen's influence. The move 17, k7 prepares to recapture the bishop on c4 and also connects the rooks, creating a more cohesive defense for the king's side. The rook now occupies the critical f-file, directly challenging black's doubled pawns and preparing to support the e4 pawn advance. This pawn capture opens the h-file for your rook and aims to create an immediate threat against white's king. This move, qxg6+, exploits the weakened dark squares around the black king after the pawn exchange and initiates a decisive attack, forcing the black king into a more exposed position. This move recaptures the bishop on c4, establishing central pawn control and preparing to connect the rooks, while also potentially initiating a queenside attack. The queen repositions to a more active central square, intending to pressure white's kingside and prepare for potential pawn pushes like e5 or d5 to open lines. This move resolves the tension in the center, opening the c-file for potential activity and preparing to contest the central pawn majority. This move opens the c-file for your rook and establishes a central pawn majority, aiming to control space and generate attacking chances on the kingside. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, aiming to support the queenside pawn structure and potentially prepare for a counterattack on the kingside. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, eyeing the b-pawn and preparing to potentially exploit the open c-file, while also supporting an advance on the queenside. This move challenges white's queen, seeking to gain time and potentially activate the rook on the a-file while defending against potential threats on the queenside. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, targeting the f7 pawn and preparing to coordinate with the rook on the open file, while also defending against potential counterplay along the a6-f1 diagonal. This move develops the knight to a more active square, aiming to support a central pawn push or potentially find tactical opportunities by attacking the white queen and rook. This move repositions the rook to control the f-file, preparing for potential attacks on black's king and offering support for white's central pawn advance or kingside operations. The move Rack 8 boldly places the rook on the semi-open c-file, aiming to pressure white's queenside pawns and potentially support a later advance of the b-pawn. White wins a pawn by exploiting black's misplaced queen and open central files. This move challenges white's powerful queen and attempts to activate black's rook along the semi-open c-file, aiming to relieve pressure and potentially create counterplay. White retreats the queen to a safe square, maintaining pressure on the queenside pawns and preparing to regroup the pieces for a potential attack on the kingside or a defense against black's encroaching rook. This move repositions the knight to a more active central square, challenging white's control of the d-file and preparing to defend the weakened queenside pawns. This knight move repositions the piece to defend the kingside and prepare for potential advances, aiming to control key central squares and support future operations. Black aims to activate the queen and create threats along the d5-2 diagonal, while preparing to contest the open c-file and potentially develop the remaining pieces. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, preparing to defend the king and potentially support a kingside attack. This move is a thematic regrouping, preparing to challenge white's queen and potentially exchange rooks to simplify the game and create counterplay on the b-file. This move aims to activate the white queen by bringing it to a more central attacking square, seeking to exploit the open lines on the kingside and put pressure on black's potentially vulnerable king. The king is stepping out of the line of fire on the dark squares, aiming to connect the rooks and prepare for potential pawn pushes or a centralized retreat. This prophylactic move prepares to defend the kingside if black's queen swings over, while also creating potential escape squares for the king and freeing the f2 rook. This move strategically places the rook on the third rank, aiming to contest the open c-file and potentially support an advance on the queenside or pressure white's king. Moving the king to h2 prepares to defend the g2 pawn and potentially opens a line for the rook on f3 to swing over to the kingside should the opportunity arise. This move prepares to reinforce the g-file attack, aiming to exploit the open lines and pressure the black king, while also potentially creating a defensive shield for white's own king. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to exploit white's slightly compromised king safety and potentially support an attack on the queenside. This move brings the queen to a more active square, eyeing the weakened dark squares around white's king and preparing to support a potential pawn advance on the kingside. This forcing check on the black king is an attempt to disrupt black's coordination and potentially win material by exploiting the exposed king position and the open files. This defensive maneuver redirects the queen to a safer square, preparing to regroup and contest white's aggressive queen and rook attack on the kingside. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, aiming to exploit potential weaknesses in black's king safety and control the central squares more effectively. Black retreats the queen to g7 to defend the f7 pawn and prepare to regroup, while white maintains a strong initiative with the rook on the 7th rank. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, potentially threatening the pawn on c5 and preparing to support an advance on the kingside or central pawn breaks. The king must seek shelter from the oncoming attack, as the open lines and white's active pieces pose a serious threat to its current position. This move initiates a critical pawn break, aiming to open lines and create attacking chances against black's king by sacrificing the pawn to expose the g6 pawn and potentially activate the queen. The move 36, k7 repositions the queen to defend the e6 pawn, which is under threat from white's advanced f5 pawn and the potential for further pawn advances on the kingside. This move forces the black king to a more vulnerable square, allowing white to coordinate its pieces for a decisive attack on the exposed monarch. This move is a desperate attempt to keep the king safe, but white's powerful central pawn and queen will continue to exert immense pressure. The queen repositions to the active e5 square, centralizing its influence and preparing to potentially join the attack on the weakened black kingside or contest control of the d-file, while also defending the f5 pawn. This move is a vital repositioning of the queen to defend the pawn on c7, which is currently under pressure from white's rook and queen, and prepares to contest the d-file. This move simplifies the position by exchanging queens, leading to an endgame where white aims to exploit black's uncoordinated pieces and potential weaknesses on the queenside. The exchange of queens simplifies the position into a rook endgame where white's passed pawn on f5 presents a significant advantage, creating immediate attacking potential on the kingside. This pawn capture opens the e-file and forces the opponent to recapture, simplifying the position and potentially leading to further exchanges that might benefit white's initiative. This pawn recapture opens the d-file for your rook, creating immediate attacking potential and challenging white's central control while preparing to centralize the king for defense. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, preparing to control central squares and potentially support a kingside attack or defend against black's passed pawn on the d-file. This move aims to activate the rook on the now open c-file, potentially targeting white's king or creating threats against the weak pawn structure. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to control the now open c-file and potentially create pressure on white's queenside. This move, a5, is a strategic attempt to restrict white's knight on e4 and potentially create a queenside pawn majority, aiming to leverage it in the endgame by opening lines for the queen. This move seeks to activate the rook on the queenside, aiming to pressure black's advanced pawn and potentially create threats on the b-file or support a central pawn advance. This move activates the king, preparing to bring it into the game and contest the center while also supporting potential pawn advances on the kingside or queenside. White repositions the rook to the 5th rank, targeting the vulnerable queenside pawns and preparing to contest the open b-file after black's next pawn advance. This move seeks to activate the rook on the 2nd rank, potentially supporting the advance of the a pawn or preparing to contest the a-file if white plays Ra3. The move a4 aims to restrict black's queenside play by preventing the b5 advance and potentially creating a weak b6 pawn after pawn exchanges. This rook maneuver aims to mobilize the king from its exposed position on d7 and potentially support the advance of the a-pawn, seeking active counterplay. With the exchange of queens and rooks, the game transitions to an endgame where white aims to leverage their material advantage and activated knight to create winning chances. This move aims to activate the rook on the c-file and contest the open file, potentially preparing to support the queenside pawn advance or create threats against white's king. This move leverages the open file to force a king into a vulnerable position, aiming to simplify into a winning endgame where the rook can support its passed pawn. This move forces an exchange of queens, simplifying the position into a rook and pawn endgame where white's better pawn structure on the kingside and potential for an active rook on the open c-file gives them a slight advantage. This pawn capture on c5 solidifies white's central presence and creates a passed pawn on the queenside, aiming to disrupt black's coordination and potentially launch a decisive attack. This move attempts to activate the knight and potentially challenge white's control of the d5 square, aiming to create counterplay in a simplified endgame where white has a pawn advantage. This pawn move aims to create a passed pawn on the kingside and potentially restrict black's knight's mobility on the queenside. The black king now enters the fray, seeking active participation to support its advanced passed pawn and contest the central squares. This knight check forces the black king to move, allowing white to further consolidate their material advantage and prepare to advance their connected passed pawns. This move attempts to consolidate the king's position, but the king is still vulnerable to checks and will need to be supported by remaining pieces to survive the ongoing attack. This check forces the black king into a more exposed position, allowing white to consolidate their material advantage and advance their passed pawn. The move 51, kf4, is a desperate attempt by black to escape the discovered check and the mating net, seeking any refuge for the king, but it leads directly to a decisive tactical sequence for white. This pawn push aims to gain space on the kingside and prepare for the kingside advance, potentially creating new attacking avenues or consolidating the pawn structure. The move prepares to activate the rook to the fourth rank, aiming to support the passed pawn and potentially contest the open file. This move begins the final push, advancing the passed pawn to restrict black's knight and create mating threats by potentially reaching the 8th rank. The black king is dangerously exposed and must find refuge, as white's pieces are actively coordinated for attack. This pawn push aims to create a passed pawn on the h-file, which could become a decisive advantage if it reaches promotion, while also forcing black's rook to defend against its advance. This move aims to connect the rook and king on the kingside, preparing to defend the h-pawn and potentially counterattack on the queenside if white's pawn push is stopped. The king steps forward to actively participate in the endgame, supporting the potential passed pawn on h7 and preparing for a kingside pawn advance. The knight's repositioning to c6 aims to support the pawn on d6 and potentially challenge white's advanced pawns, while also preparing for potential pawn pushes or regrouping to a more active square. This move aims to activate the king, preparing to support the passed pawn on h7 and prevent the opponent's knight from infiltrating further into white's position. The move 56, kg7, is a necessary defensive maneuver to evade the immediate threat of mate on h8, and it also prepares to regroup the king to a safer square, likely to support the remaining knight and potentially defend the weak pawn structure. This move prepares to push the h-pawn, aiming to create a passed pawn that can advance towards the queening square and create mating threats against the black king. This move aims to activate the rook from its passive position, prepare for potential counterplay along the 3rd rank, and challenge white's advanced kingside pawns. This move, b5, develops the bishop to a more active square, controlling the long diagonal and preparing to support a kingside advance or potentially exploit weaknesses around black's king. The rook move aims to activate the piece along the newly opened d-file, potentially supporting the g-pawn's advance or preparing to challenge white's control of the c-file, and centralize the piece for future action. This move prepares to advance the pawn to g6, creating a powerful passed pawn that will require significant attention from black's king and pieces, potentially leading to decisive material gains or a mating attack. This move is a desperate attempt to create a mating net or at least disrupt white's king's safety, as the black king is deeply exposed and white's passed pawns are about to become unstoppable. This move forces the black king back to the safety of the kingside after a desperate attempt to escape the attack. consolidating white's advantage in the endgame. The capture of the knight on e5 is a decisive tactical sequence that simplifies the position and leads to an easily winning endgame for white due to the advanced passed pawn on h7. This is a forcing move, sacrificing the knight to dislodge black's king and potentially set up a mating net by exploiting the weak dark squares around the king.